Well, hi everyone, I'm Marissa. I'm the marketing coordinator for our Mathnasium group. I'm going to be handling the Q&A portion today, so if you have any questions, by all means, please type them into the Q&A. If you have anything else to send us, you can go ahead and put it into the chat. But for the most part, the Q&A is going to be the best way to get your questions answered. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Alec for his lovely presentation.
Thank you, Marissa. Hello, everybody. My name is Alec, and I am the Center Director of the Mathnasium of Chester in Richmond, Virginia. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about positive math engagement in your home. So this topic is important to me for both personal and professional reasons. From a personal perspective, my younger sister struggled with math for a long time growing up and had a very negative kind of experience and perception of math for a long time. And from a professional standpoint, this is one of the most common presenting problems that parents come into for us about Mathnasium is that their student doesn't like math and it's hard for them to interact positively with their kid while doing math. It just leads to frustration. So this presentation was put together with the intention of giving you some tips and tricks for interacting positively with your kids. So first thing that we're going to talk about is, why does this matter? And you might think to yourself, that's kind of a weird question to ask, because of course this matters, right? Of course we want to interact positively with our kids. We don't want to interact negatively, but having some specific reasons about why this matters and how this is going to affect your child's future, I think will help you to continue to engage in these behaviors and help your kids engage in these behaviors far down the road. So I want to present two mindsets to you first, a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. So there's a picture that kind of details some thought processes associated with these mindsets. So fixed mindset is one that is limited in nature. So doesn't believe that their potential will lead to any, or that their work will lead to any sort of success. You can see one of the bullet points in there is, my potential is predetermined. Students who struggle with math and have struggled with math for a long time tend to have these types of mindsets. They've failed and failed for so long that they no longer believe that their efforts are going to result in anything different than failure. And contrast that with a growth-oriented mindset, which is the exact opposite. So it's a mindset that knows that work and effort leads to growth and achievement. So some common thought process with this is, I like to try new things. My efforts and attitudes determine my abilities. And so we want to encourage growth-oriented mindsets in our children. And research shows that growth-oriented mindsets lead to success in the future. And this makes sense because perceptions of success and achievement are long-lasting. If we continue to help children develop these mindsets, then they are going to continue to think this way far past when they are in elementary and middle school math. This will go well into their future. It's also far spreading. So we are talking today in the context of math, but helping students achieve a growth-oriented mindset is not just going to help them with math, it's going to help them with everything. It's going to affect how they think about everything. But talking about this in the context of math is important because math is important. Typically, when students and even families think about math, they think about specific topics like adding fractions, geometry, algebra, very specific things. But at its core, math is about logic. It's about reasoning, problem solving, and critical thinking. And it's hard to think of topics in school other than math that don't use these facets, right? And it's also hard to think of future career paths that students might take that wouldn't be benefited from being competent and confident in these facets as well. So again, we want to encourage this growth-oriented mindset. Now, in order to do that, we need to know how children learn. Before we can start implementing specific strategies, we need to know what are the mechanisms by which children learn. Now, there are a few ways that children learn. We're just going to talk about two specifically today. And those two are reinforcement and observational and social learning. So starting with reinforcement, we're specifically interested in positive reinforcement. And positive reinforcement is the continuation or increasing the likelihood of a behavior to keep happening by giving somebody something they desire. And so one way we do this in the centers is we have what's called a reward cabinet. It's filled with all sorts of goodies, and children, when they're at Mathnasium, they work hard on their math, and they get to turn in that hard work for punches on a punch card, which they can then turn in for things like gift cards or candy. Now, that's a very materialistic way to increase the likelihood that students are going to continue to be motivated. But it doesn't just have to be materialistic. We can also influence people's behavior by giving them, emotional things that they want. So I've listed one common way that this is done is by the use of attaboys or attagirls. And so this is just, really it's compliments. So whenever your student does something that you're proud of them for, let them know. So if they do a problem right, or maybe they just persist through that problem that was giving them a lot of trouble, tell them, good job, or I'm really proud of you. Those are also positive reinforcers. And research also shows that positive reinforcement is so much more effective at encouraging and motivating students and reinforcing that behavior than things like punishment. Now, the other way that we're going to talk about children learning is through observational and social learning. Children learn by mimicking the behavior of those that they see. And who are some of the most present figures in the students' lives? Their parents or their guardians. And it doesn't stop at just seeing. Obviously, students, if they see you do something, they'll learn how to do that by watching. But children are very perceptive, and they will even pick up on things like attitudes or tones of your voice when you talk about certain things. And this is important specifically for math because maybe you're a parent who did not have a great math experience growing up. And when you talk about math, a lot of times, even subconsciously, those negative tones will come out, and children pick up on that. And so it's very easy for children to be influenced by this. And knowing that, we can influence it in the opposite way. So now that we kind of have some mechanisms by which children learn, let's get into some specific strategies for positive engagement. So the first one is positive talk. Now, this is pretty straightforward, but it's still important to talk about. Talk about math in a positive way and avoid negative phrases. We don't want students to think negatively about math, but how can we do that? So one way is to create a safe space to talk about frustration. It's almost inevitable that students are going to struggle slightly, whether that's with a problem or a new concept. And so instead of just making so that students don't struggle at all, let's just create a safe space for them to be frustrated. Frustration doesn't always have to be negative. A common phrase that we like to use at Mathnasium is growth happens outside of your comfort zone. And so allowing students to have a positive way to release that frustration and talk about that is a way that you can encourage them to work through that frustration. A specific tip that I have for some common things that students say, let's, for instance, say that your child is working through a problem and they just say, I can't do this. I haven't learned how to do this, and I can't do this. Well, add the word yet onto that negative sentence. So when your student says, I can't do this, you can respond with, well, maybe you just can't do this yet. And so it allows you to work through the frustration and turn and reframe that negative sentence that your student has and give it some optimism that we just need to work through this. It's not that you can't do this. It's just that we need to practice more until this is something you're comfortable with. Lastly, again, if you're a parent who maybe had negative experiences in math growing up, it's inevitable that those kind of experiences might flare back up when you're talking about math with your student who might be frustrating. But try and talk about those past experiences in a framework of growth and learning. That can be difficult, but talk about how you grew from working through those experiences, or maybe what you learned that you can teach your student. The next thing we're going to do is encourage persistence and experimentation. So don't give up. It's very easy for students to want to give up. They find something that's frustrated, they get to kind of a roadblock, and then they just give up. And don't let them do this. There's an illustration at the bottom of this page that I think illustrates this very well. Students will try, and then they'll fail. And for students that have that fixed mindset, they've been struggling with math, and they haven't developed that growth-oriented mindset, or they don't have that positive influence to help them get through this. They're going to try, they're going to fail, and that cycle stops there. They're not going to try again, and they're never going to get to that point where they win or they succeed. But students that have that growth-oriented mindset, or students that have an influence that can help them continue that cycle, you'll try, you'll fail, maybe you try again, and maybe you fail again. But eventually, after you keep trying and you persist through the frustration and through the difficulty, eventually you will try and you will win, or you'll try and you'll succeed. And encourage students to know that math and learning can take time. Even at Mathnasium, we are helping students develop creative and efficient ways to do math, but that doesn't mean that math can be taught overnight. Math and learning take time, and there are no shortcuts there. So make sure students know that it's not that they can't get this and that there's something wrong with them if they don't get it right away. They just need to practice. And then lastly, with the experimentation, there's always more than one way to approach a problem. Even if you're not sure what that best approach is, just encourage your students to experiment a little bit. And going back to the positive talk just for a minute, a lot of times the answer is not as important as the process by which we get there. And so if we can take out maybe the importance of getting this right, students will be more encouraged to experiment with different ways. Now, that's not to say that getting the right answer isn't important, but both of those things are important. It's getting the right answer, but also working the process by which we get there. Next, we're going to work through helping students understand math versus just knowing math. Now, this is something specifically for you parents and guardians to do. So typically, students in school have kind of been taught the process of they do a math worksheet, they get their answers, they turn it in, and then their teachers let them know whether their answers are right or wrong. But we can change this. We can change how we get students to think about the process of doing math. And so let's encourage our students to do math and then prove how they know that their answers are correct. And so you can help this process by, once a student answers a question, ask them questions like, how did you know that? How did you get that answer? How do you know that's the right answer? Or maybe they're not done with the problem and they're getting a little bit stuck. Encourage them with questions like, well, what could you do next? Do you see any patterns that might help you solve this problem? And so again, getting students to think about their thought process. This isn't something that is just innate in students. It's taught and it's learned. And then again, you cannot know how to do your child's math, especially if they are dealing with fractions or maybe something you're not comfortable with. You cannot know how to do that your child's math, but you can still guide them on that positive thought process. So it's not about just knowing the math that your student is doing. It's about encouraging them and just giving them a positive space to work. Nextly, we are going to encourage students to do math in a way that makes sense. There is one big way we can encourage students to do this, which is draw pictures. Students don't often think about drawing pictures with math unless they're kind of introduced to the idea. And so I have to the right of here a problem that we typically have in Mathnasium that I want you to think about how this problem might be different if we didn't have this picture. If one zebra eats 2 apples, there's 2 questions here. How many apples do 2 zebras eat, and how many zebras eat 6 apples? With these pictures, it's pretty easy. A very young student could draw the apples in these boxes or draw the zebras in those boxes and then count, and they can visually see those groups. And this problem that might be more difficult becomes actually, pretty easy. But I want you to think about if that picture wasn't there, how much more difficult might it be for a student to grasp this concept? And so encourage your students to draw pictures. Maybe draw a picture for them and then get them to draw one. And maybe be creative, do some macaroni art, something like that. Have some fun with it. Another way to do this is bring out some manipulatives. There's things all over your house that serve more math purposes than you would ever know. Things like rulers, a deck of cards, a pair of dice, anything like that that you might be able to use to just give your students something to hold on to encourage them to think math about or to think about math in a way that's different. Now, this is probably my favorite slide in the whole presentation because it's the one that I think is, once you get into it, the easiest to do and one that has some of the most impact. So math in the real world. Like we said, math is everywhere. And so we want to find reasons to ask math questions when we are out and about. And so to the right, I have a picture here of a mom and a daughter, presumably at the grocery store. And I want you to think about all of the questions that you might be able to ask while you're at the grocery store. I'm going to give you a few examples, but there are tons of questions we can ask. And they range from low math all the way to even middle school math. There are tons of variations of problems. So to give you 3 examples, let's start with somebody who's in kindergarten. You might not think about grocery store math as something you can do with a student so young, but think about what kind of things students in kindergarten or even first grade are doing. They're learning their fundamentals. They're learning how to count. So maybe you're in the grocery store, you grab a bag and you ask your child, can you go grab me 10 apples? And that might seem like a very mundane task, but for that student, that's a very meaningful way for them to practice counting, especially up to 10, which is a very important number. For a student who is maybe in upper elementary, 4th or 5th grade math, maybe you have a party going on this weekend and you ask your child, hey, we need 24 cans of soda for our party this weekend, but each of these packs only holds 6. So can you help me figure out how many packs of soda we need to buy so that everybody gets one? And that's a good way for your student to practice multiplication and division facts. And then lastly, let's say you have a student who's practicing percentages. They're in 5th or 6th grade, and there's 2 items. There's one for $4 and there's one for $10, but that $10 one is 50% off. You can ask them, what would that price be now? Which one should I buy? And practice percentages that way. Now, that's just in one place. So you can see the variety of questions we can ask in just one place that you go to very often. Another way that we can practice math is by money. Something that I know I had when I grew up was chores and allowance. And so if you are a parent or a guardian who gives your child an allowance for chores that they do, here's an example of how you can make it meaningful and math oriented. Let's say your child wants a video game that's coming out and it's $60. And the student really wants that. Well, let's say they earn $5 for every chores that they do. So you might say to your student, okay, you earn $5 for every chore that you do. How many chores would you need to do in order to afford this video game you want? And that's important for a few reasons. So first and foremost, again, it practices math. But secondly, it gives them a time frame. It encourages them to think about math in the real world and use those skills. And that's something that they will most likely use and continue to use in the future with other things that they want. So again, just a few examples. But now we're going to practice. So I have a picture on the screen of a father and a son. They're cooking some peppers, it looks very yummy. But think of this picture as just the kitchen, another area that you might commonly be in with your child. And so I like some participation if we can. What are some questions you could ask your child while you're cooking? This could be anything, but feel free to type into the chat what kind of questions you would ask to help encourage your students to think about how math is used. We'll take just a few minutes to do this.
Okay, so we're seeing some answers come in. So first one I have is, what is half a cup of flour plus another half a cup? That's a good one, adding fractions.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, absolutely. We can take one more. Anybody else have one?
So I see another measurement equivalence. So if we're doubling a recipe, how many cups of sugar do we need if we originally needed like 3/4 of a cup of sugar?
Yeah, that's a great one. It practices proportional reasoning. Very nice.
I would actually add that you could even do things not with fractions. So even something like, let's see, how many slices from each food group did you use? I like that one. So how many slices? How many ingredients did we use? Might also be a good one for a younger student.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, and just like before, this is a good way to think about, maybe you have multiple children who are in the kitchen at one time. You can ask a question that is appropriate for all of those age ranges. Awesome. Very nice. Thank you for your participation. So I encourage you to just think about ways that once, maybe even today, once you're done with this, how can you talk about math in the real world with your children? Okay, now the next one is also a fun one. So slide is called Family Game Night, but really this is just about, again, introducing some fun into math and how, there are lots of resources readily available to do math in a way that you might not thought of. So make math into something to look forward to. You can do math without even thinking about it. So there are games that are math oriented, like completely, and I put a picture of one down in the right-hand corner called 4-Way Countdown that we typically use in Mathnasium. So this is one that practices addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, a very math-oriented game. But there are all sorts of ways that we can do games, but not use one that's specifically oriented towards any specific math skill. So one that you might not think about, going back to the concept of math being a concept about logic, reasoning, critical thinking, checkers and chess, those are excellent games to encourage critical thinking and reasoning. You can also do playing cards and dice. And I have an example here that I'm going to show you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. And so I have a deck of cards right here that I've split. Now these are Mathnasium cards, and they don't have faces on them, but face cards will work just as well. So you can use like aces as one, things like that. But we are going to do a game called 10 Slam. This is very easy, and it's something that your students can do very easily. And students, we've done this lots of times before at things like our math nights, and students have a blast with this game. So you'll divide a deck of cards into 2 piles. And if you ever played a game called like Slapjack, it's pretty much the same thing, but students are going to have one pile be theirs, and so they're going to flip their cards over, one on top of the other. So if you can see this is 9 and 10. And so the goal here is for the top 2 cards to make 10. Now, obviously, we didn't achieve that with this first one, but we do another pair, that's 6, and that's 4. Now, somebody who knows their complements of 10 is going to see that, and they're going to slap it. And then they would get those cards. And if you keep going, then you would get a big pile, and you just keep going until the top 2 numbers make 10. And this is a really fun game that is very easy to do because if you have a deck of cards around, and it's also a game that students tend to just have a blast with. So just an example of how you can use a household item or a game that you probably have around your house to interact positively with your kids in math. Now, the last tip that I have is one that is also important. And it's not necessarily one that you need to do with your child, but it is knowing that asking for help is okay. So all of these tips are designed to help you as parents and guardians interact with your child in a way that is positive. But sometimes maybe you need help. Maybe something's not working. Maybe there's a tip that's not on here that would be perfect for your child. And so just as true as it is for students to ask for help, you can also seek out resources when needed. And so this is where Mathnasium can help. So just know that there are resources out there that can help your child think positively and have fun with math, and that we are here to help you in that way. Our goal is to make sure that students have the foundational facts they need to succeed, but we also work together with the parents to make sure that they have all the tools that they need in order to continue that growth outside of the center. And so lastly, we're just going to do a summary of everything that we've talked about. And so the first point is we are all math people. There are lots of individuals that think that they are not math people, but they just don't know it yet. We are all math people. We all have the ability to do math, and we all have the ability to be successful. Second is stay engaged with your children. Using all these techniques, find times and find ways to just interact with your kids, whether that's for 30 seconds or 10 minutes, whatever it might be. Find bits and pieces of time throughout the day to have a moment with your child that is positive. And then lastly, encourage a mindset of growth and exploration. This overarching theme is not letting students get into that fixed mindset. When they struggle, they need that positive influence there to get them out of that kind of static cycle that they might be in. And so helping them get out of that frustration, know that frustration is okay, and know that that frustration will help them grow is ultimately what we want. So with all that, that's all I have for you all. So I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, y'all can go ahead and type those into the Q&A. It should be a button at the bottom of your page, and we'll go ahead and get those answered. If you don't have any questions, thank you for coming. We're really glad that everyone was here. We helped you out a lot and gave you some ideas on how to engage with your kids.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Okay, so first question. Manipulatives are an excellent idea. How can we use them to create a positive experience for higher level math students? So for background, that student is in middle school.
Okay, that's a great question. So a few ones that come to mind, I think. So dice, so some of the topics that middle school children are exposed to that they have problems with are things like probability, or percentages or things like that. So if you wanted a way to interact positively with your kid with things like probability, get a pair of dice, roll them, and ask, okay, what's the probability that we get a 5 on this dice? And you can even make a game out of it. One, we have an excellent game at Mathnasium that I could send a follow-up email with that kind of makes a game out of this concept. But another one that you might use is, let's say you have, you could practice like going out to dinner, and when you get your bill, how do you do a tip? And you can write all that out. How, what are good ways that you can practice those percentages. And then another thing that we can do is if you have like a whiteboard or anything like that available, you might be able to kind of create a grid that shows if you have of probabilities as well, and talk about things that are likely to happen, not likely to happen. And this is important for concepts like with the probability in the dice. If you have 2 dice, you can roll them. What's the probability that those dice add up to 8 or things like that? And you can use a whiteboard to kind of draw that picture and help your student visually see that. Those are a few that I can think of.
Okay, so next question is, I have a 4th grader that's still using their fingers to count. Is there a good way to get her away from that?
Absolutely. So the first way that I would recommend doing that. So finger counting is very much a habit. And we all use our fingers at some point, right? If we have 10 of them, it's very easy to use, but we need to break that habit. But the thing that typically doesn't happen when you tell your child, hey, stop finger counting, is you need to replace it with something better. And so that kind of goes back to to asking questions like, how do you know that? So maybe you work with your child, you ask them a question like 2 plus 3, like sums under 10. You start small, where they probably don't have to use their fingers. And if you ask them what's 2 plus 3 and they say 5, ask them, how do you know that? And really build on that knowledge that they say. And they might say, well, I have 3 and 2 more above that would be 5. And then once we get to sums that are maybe above 10 that are a little bit more likely that students are using their fingers with, again, kind of almost have them put their hands on the table so that they're not using their fingers, and ask them, what are you thinking? If they feel like they really need to use their fingers, let them kind of be in that uncomfortable spot for a minute. It might take them 30 seconds to get that answer of maybe like what 5 plus 6 is, but let them be in that kind of uncomfortable space for a few minutes. And when they finally get that answer, ask them, okay, how did you know that? How did you get there? And then work with them to see if that was a positive or an effective way to do that problem. There are a few other, I think I don't know if there's any more presentations, but numerical fluency is kind of what we're getting into here. And there's a lot of specific strategies we have for that. And there might be a Mathnasium close to you. I think it would be a great idea if you gave that director a call and they could talk with you through some specific strategies that we typically use for those students. But I think from this presentation, the thing that I would recommend most is getting them to stop their finger counting and then talking through the process of how they get that answer with them.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Alec, for this valuable information.
Thank you, everyone.